Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker. Most of us know that a great business starts with a good idea, but how do those good ideas really become successful businesses? Where should you start? How do you make decisions like determining if you should rent office space or work out of your garage? How should you handle legal issues that come up, and what does it mean to be a Christian entrepreneur anyway? Drawing from his work as a legal expert and business coach, Baruch Shinen is here to help aspiring entrepreneurs turn their ideas and passions into viable businesses. His new book is an easy-to-use guide which includes self-assessment tools that will lead you through the 4 critical stages of starting and running a business. You'll learn to evaluate your ideas, create a viable business plan, form collaborative teams, and build a business that's both meaningful and profitable. Baruch Shinen is a lawyer, a speaker, an author, and the founder of the law offices of Baruch Shinen Incorporated, which represents some of the largest churches in America. Baruch is a highly sought-after business advisor and personal business strategist to globally recognized organizations and ministries. He's spoken at conferences and business gatherings, including the National Religious Broadcasters National Convention, the Southern Baptist National Convention, the Vineyard USA National Conference, and his writing has been featured in publications such as the Huffington Post. You can learn more about him at BaruchShinen, SHINEN.com. Joining us now to talk about his new book, The Christian Entrepreneur, Dream, Plan, Execute, Grow, is Baruch Shinen. Baruch, welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth.
Rabbi Eric, I'm so happy to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, we're delighted. I come out of a strong corporate background where I started out with Wrangler, which was part of Bluebell, which was one of the largest clothing manufacturers in the world. Today, they're absorbed by Vanity Fair. Went from there into my own business, then I worked my way through the ranks to become a national sales manager with AT&T, and then moved over to a directorship at Hewlett-Packard, all executing these principles. Before I came to faith, this was the world that I grew up in the 70s, 80s, gamesmanship, climbed the corporate ladder on the backs of those. You build a ladder of people's backs, and you climb the ladder that way. When you finally get to the top, and there's 1 or 2 above you, then your model changes and says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to grab a hold of you, and I'm going to push you as hard as I can into the next level. You're going to bump that top person out, and I'm going to take your position.
Right.
That's my 5-year plan. Are you on board? And they say, hey, if you can get me promoted to president, absolutely, I'm in. So when I became a believer and began to build a congregation, I looked at a model, and none of the models that I had used in corporate America actually translated, because now I had to develop people, and I wasn't able to interview them based on the best closer or the best client relations. I had to look at the spiritual gifting and all these other aspects that were really quite foreign to me as a young believer, and really had no model as I planted a new work. That I called people and said, hey, how did you get started? And they said, oh, well, we were a plant out of a church. We already had 120 people, and they went with us. And so I had a hard time finding anybody that started from scratch. So I had to create the very first business plan for the congregation. Something that when I talked to my peer group, they go, you have a business plan?
Crazy, right?
You have a business plan, like you have a target marketing and media approach, and how you're going to break. And I had come to a city where I didn't know anybody. I didn't have one person, so I had to use media to kind of get the message out, and that built the flock with that message. You've come at this in a very interesting way, because I'll make the statement, pastors are as bad at being business people as doctors. And although churches, nonprofits have a higher, more, let's say, socially or spiritually impacting mission statement, dollars and cents are still involved. Growth, wealth management, property acquisition, property management, having the right, actually good to great, having the right people on the bus,
Right.
and then having them in the right seat on the bus is a foreign concept to a pastor.
Right.
And to a young person starting out or an older person who wants to become a Christian entrepreneur. This is a unique and fabulous tool. Take me back to where your faith journey began, and when law and faith, which are really two kind of distinct areas, but yet the whole Bible is a book of law. It's a book of justice. Right. It's a whole system created. Our whole Socratic system is built on the Mosaic system. It's a mirror image of what was created by Jethro in his counsel to Moses in the very first time when he sat with him, and one man handling all the needs of all the others. Where did that begin for you?
I would say at 2 points, because the law piece didn't come until much later. So the faith journey of it, I grew up in a house where my dad was a pastor, my mom was a worship leader. My grandparents had a traveling quartet ministry, so they were on the road bringing the gospel. I had a lot of people in my family that were in different aspects of ministry, whether it was pastor, missionaries, worship leaders, that sort of thing. So I grew up in an environment where I was constantly thrown into and being sown in ministry. I was around it nonstop. And I actually remember the day when I gave my life to the Lord. I think I always say, if I could have when I was in the womb, I would have. But I remember the moment I was visiting my grandma's church in Hollywood, a little Foursquare church. And I remember the pastor did an altar call, and my dad was standing there, and he was a real authority figure, and he was kind of blocking the aisle. And I remember thinking, I want Jesus, and I'm not going to let my dad's arms stop me. He's kind of standing there with his hands on the pew. And I'm like, I'm going to run down there and give my life to Jesus. And so I took off under his arms, and I remember like just that feeling, almost like in movies where, the dad's like reaching to grab the kid because I take off running. But I'm running towards the altar, and I get down there and I'm like, God, I want you, and I don't want anything else. I don't want the world. I want you. And that was the beginning of sort of my decision in ministry and being immersed in ministry and being immersed in Jesus. And so that's kind of my life. But through, as I got older, I started to realize I really want to help people. I really want to sow into people. And when you grow up in ministry, I think that you're kind of given a few options, right? Well, you could be a pastor, you could be a missionary, you could be a worship leader. And that's kind of it. You kind of feel like you're either teaching, preaching, or, doing music or something. And what I started to realize is, no, I could help people by talking to them. Because even at a young age, I remember in high school, I was getting calls from people that were friends, peers, that were severely depressed, saying, look, I'm done with this life. I'm ready to go. I'd get calls in the middle of the night. And, back then, my parents were on the other, on the phone, upstairs or whatever, listening. And I would just talk to them, and I would kind of talk them down. And I remember from a young age that God would use me to kind of talk peace into people. And so I quickly realized, I think I want to be a psychologist. I think I want to, of course, like every kid I went through, well, I want to be a marine biologist. I want to be this. But I got to the point where I'm like, I know how I'm going to help people. I'm going to do therapy. I'm going to be a counselor, a therapist. And so I started going that direction, and I went to undergrad in psychology and got a bachelor's in psychology. And then I went, the next logical thing was to do a master's and PhD program in clinical psychology. So I started that, and midway through it, some things happened in my life, really significant things where I said, God, if this is not where you want me, I'll go wherever. Tell me what that is. Tell me what you want me to do. And so I felt like he told me to drop out of school, quit my job. So I was counseling at the time, and wait on him, just listen. And I was going to church. I was going to a big church in Anaheim, California at the time. And through a series of things, I ended up getting a job at a Christian music publishing company. And through some circumstances there, within months, I found myself taking over all of the operations of publishing and licensing. And it was then that I felt like God said, "Now I want you to go to law school." And I was like, law school? Like, this doesn't make sense, right? So kind of to your question, it was a two-part journey, in terms of, walking with God towards my destiny, and that law piece never being there. Never once as a kid thinking, oh, maybe I'll be a lawyer. I literally can never remember a time where I thought, I'd love to be a lawyer. And there's a lot of other things I remember wanting to be. But it was the moment when I felt like God spoke to me and said, "And now I want you to go to law school." I said, this makes perfect sense. And that's what I did.
So in law school, you're still walking with the Lord. I mean, you've been through. Now, did you become a Christian counselor, or did you just become a counselor incorporating biblical principles?
At that point, I was still in graduate school, so I wasn't, legally authorized to be my own counselor. So I was more of like a student counselor where I had a supervising counselor. Um, so I didn't really have the authority to make that decision. If I had, I probably would have said, I'm a counselor, but I'm a Christian. So obviously, the spiritual component's coming into it naturally, but I never had that chance.
So you get this counseling training. Did you finish your master's?
No, I dropped out literally, I think I was a few classes short of my master's.
Okay, and what did you do in that period between dropping out and getting the call to go to law school?
Well, I stressed for a bit. And I said, Lord, I don't know what to do. So I was going to this church and I was like, I have to find a job. I had school loans. I had, it's like life starts to catch up on you, right? And I said, God, I need something, please help me find a job or tell me what my next step is. So I had known some people on the worship team at the church, and one of them said, "Well, hey, this company's hiring." And it was actually Vineyard Music Group. So if people are familiar with the Vineyard movement, so I was at the Vineyard Anaheim, and Vineyard Music at the time was becoming one of the fastest growing worship labels in the world.
All right.
And so one of the worship leaders said, Brock, there's a job in the accounting department. I said, I don't know anything about accounting. I've never taken an accounting class. And they said, well, just apply, see what happens. So I fill out my application and submit it. I don't know how, I'm sure just the grace of God and people kind of standing by my side, but I got an interview, and the CFO, it's as if I walked in and that's the first time he's seen my resume, and he's like, no accounting, no accounting experience. He's like, have you ever even worked a cash register? And I said, no, never anything like that. And he's like, I have, he's like, you do realize we're one of the fastest growing worship labels in the world? I said, yeah, I understand that. And he's like, I have a line of people out the door that are qualified and overqualified. And we talked for a bit, obviously, but he goes, there's just, I just feel like I'm supposed to give the job to you. And it was weird, right? I said, okay, well, I'll take it. So I started working. I was literally the lowest in the accounting department. I'm pretty sure I was the lowest in the entire company. But within, I'd say about 6 months, the manager of the company, Chris Wimber at the time, said, hey, he came in the office, and I didn't know him, and I didn't think he knew me. And he said, hey, there's something on you, and I want to train you to take over all of our publishing and licensing, which, given the circumstances at that time, I mean, this is the 90s. This is, or excuse me, yeah, the 90s. Vineyard Music is exploding. Everybody in worship is emulating what Vineyard's doing, and that seemed insane, right? But God just set that up. So it was through the series of working on contracts and licensing, I became interested in the subject of law, but I finally felt like I heard God say, now go to law school. And so I went at night and still worked full time. So that was kind of that process.
So during this time, you got exposed to in a faith environment. So you're surrounded by the ethical standards in which a true Christian business. I mean, when I sat with Steve Green of Hobby Lobby, we talked about the principles that are fundamental, foundational truths in business, which are not necessarily the same order of priority. I just wrote a letter to the new CEO of Wells Fargo. Let's kind of give you an idea. And my Secretary Treasurer and I were going in to open up the new bank account for the new church we were launching. And we walked into the branch, and he lives in a different part of town. We hardly ever see each other, but we had all the documents, and we both had to be there at the same time. We walked into the branch, and they said, well, we're sorry, all the business bankers are off today. And I said, they said, you'll have to call, make an appointment when it's more convenient. And I said, more convenient for who? So I wrote the chairman of the board, president of Wells Fargo, a letter. And I said, I just read where you paid $35 billion in fines, and you just slapped with another set of fines. And you said you were going to turn the company around because your priorities were investors first, employees second, and customers third. Yeah. I said, I will tell you as a 68-year-old man with over 45 years of business experience, you have it all wrong. The first line is customers. Yeah. If you have customers, you need employees. If you need employees, you'll get investors. I said, your mission statement, your vision is backwards, and now you've given me pause that I have a leader handling my money, that you've already been through this embarrassment of collusion and corruption. But I put it in bold words and just said, your response will determine whether or not our ministry and me personally and all of my people that are hearing this are going to stay with your company. I haven't heard back from them yet, but it was a very direct saying, sorry, it's not the right order.
Right.
I came out of the world where it said that nothing starts in the consumer world until somebody sells something. That's the catalyst that begins the engine, so that all other pieces, nothing's acquired, nothing's manufactured, nothing until somebody sells something. So it was very interesting that in a environment, like I said, talking to Steve Green and others we've had on the show to talk about this, that there is a model in the Bible for ethical treatment, ethical construct, and you can be successful at it.
Right.
In going to law school, of course, you saw what man has done to other man.
Right.
Case law being a huge part of what you had to torts and all those things you had to study, be able to quote. Did it leave you with a feeling that you were reading about just as many cases, the backstory of the individual you might not know? There had to be an equal number of believers as there were non-believers, that our law libraries are not filled with only lawsuits between non-believers, that believers act as corruptly and engage themselves in the same level and difficulty and complexity as the rest of the world. How did you process that?
I think I probably came into it somewhat understanding that was already reality. I don't think that particular piece surprised me, and I don't know that I ever broke it down that way. I think more than anything, to your point, I think the great realization for me was that in the case law, what gets in the books, what we call, in the books, whether we can search for a case, and when lawyers talk about, well, there's a case cited on this, we have to understand that what's cited is typically a case that's been appealed. So there's this whole first layer, and it's almost like a triangle, and at the base of the triangle is every lawsuit that's being filed. And then, the vast majority of those cases get settled. So then there's a small percentage of those cases that actually get appealed. And at that level is when we start what we call the reporting process. Basically, if I'm going to look for a case that's reported, it's basically a case that's been on appeal at some level. And I think the big realization for me was there's a lot of craziness that's happening in lawsuits, Christians and non-Christians alike, that we never even hear about. We never read about. And the only place we can practically find information about these cases is through journalism, not in the case books. And so I think that was kind of a big realization of like, what's happening at this lower level? What's happening where all these fights are starting? And that's where, because of my background in the church, and also by this time I was, involved in ministry in the church, small groups where we would pray for people, 2 or 3 people, larger groups of ministry at church where we'd be dealing with different issues, and I'd been on mission trips. So I'd been around ministry enough to see the world is crazy, and Christians are just as crazy as people that are not Christians, not believers. And that's kind of the meeting point for everything that you just said. For me, was less about Christians versus non-Christians and realizing there's a whole mess happening down here on the bottom in cases being filed and withdrawn and cases being filed and settled and whatever that are not appealed and not reported. So that was actually what I would say drew a lot more of my own curiosity of like, what's happening down here? And that probably was a lot of the instigation towards wanting to understand the mechanics of how things break down. I think you've really hit the nail on the head in terms of like, where did that process start? I'd say it's probably there in law school, realizing there's a huge missing piece here. We don't even talk about the 95% of all cases settle before trial. That's a rough
Right.
estimate. What about those 95% of all cases? What's going on there? Why did they get there? And that's where I really started to dig in to the actual breakdown.
Scripture is very clear with between two believers, settle your matters on the way to court, or you might be handed over to the judge that's not a believer, and he's going to take everything from you and throw you in prison. That's problematic. If you're in ministry, there are legal issues that come between vendors and dissatisfied customers and actions filed and those kind of things. But as somebody starting out, this entrepreneurial spirit, and wanting to catch them before, which I think is kind of your approach, is say, if I can get you before you start building your organization, you start down the track and you start building inertia or momentum, and you build up enough speed that you're on that track and there is no jump off point. Let's get you started right.
Yeah.
And then second to that is freeze frame. If you've read this book and you find out you haven't done any of it, and you're in business and the business is okay, it could be exponentially better if you would freeze frame and go back and do some of these things, because you may have money in the bank, you may be getting a paycheck, you may be paying your employees, and there may be growth, but it's the same principle as the Bible. God wants us to bear fruit. If we're bearing fruit for the kingdom, He's going to come along and prune us, because only a pruned bush bears more fruit. So if this is the case, as I say, okay, in my business, been around 6, 7, 8 years, and I'm bearing fruit, but is there more to this? Could I be doing more? Maybe it's time to rethink my future strategy instead of just going along until I wind up hitting the wall. When you approached this project, and of course you have other books, best-selling books on the subject, a number of articles you've written that have really gone quite viral, but your 2 Amazon best-selling books, Crush the Stops, An Entrepreneur's Guide to Finishing Things, and The Christian Entrepreneur. This one, Dream, Plan, Execute, and Grow. which is a stellar piece. I can tell you that as a business person and as a minister, head of a ministry. As in a business plan, there is that issue called barrier to entry. Identifying what it is that's going to keep me. What factors? Is it supply? Is it demand? Is it cash flow? Is it market saturation? Is it competition? Is it, what are the things that are going to keep me from getting to where I want to go?
Right.
In your experience, what's the barrier to entry for a Christian to get this book, to recognize that they need a blueprint, they need a model that certainly the Holy Spirit is a tremendous guide, leader, but when it comes to balancing budgets and allocating resources and calculating ROI and time value of money and cost-benefit ratios, the Holy Spirit's not into those ratios. So what's the barrier to entry to getting people who want to start a business and want to be a Christian entrepreneur, even have a business? What's the barrier to entry to get them to embrace change?
Such a great question. My initial reaction is the barrier to entry is that if we learn the tools, if we start to look at the actual steps towards what can make us better business people, that we now have to take ownership and responsibility of that knowledge, right? And I think like anything in life, when you could look at a subject from a distance and say, I kind of understand this. I mean, we see this all the time, every day in media, social media in particular. We become experts because we read an article or two and we know some talking points, right? But if you really dig into a subject, you're going to have to take ownership and responsibility for the reality that you're probably going to find tension. You're going to find tension in the evidence. You're going to find tension in what you're supposed to do versus what you are doing, or what you're doing versus what you're supposed to do. And when you find that tension, you're going to be forced with, do I acknowledge it? Do I address it? Do I pretend it's not there? And I would say that the barrier of entry in entrepreneurs getting this book is that it's basically a calling card, a wake-up card rather, to say, are you ready to actually start facing some of the fundamental issues in business that maybe you don't know, and maybe you think you know, maybe you never even looked at, maybe you partially understand? Are you ready and willing to start looking at those things and saying, what if I'm wrong? What if what I have been doing is incomplete? What if there's a piece that I can implement tomorrow that I haven't looked at? Because now we have to take responsibility. And if we take responsibility, we also become responsible for the outcome. And I think you may have been alluding to this. I certainly don't want to put words in your mouth, but you may have been alluding to this kind of in the opening time when we're talking together. We talk about pastors, they're not trained in business. And pastors are not typically, they're not experts in business. A lot of pastors actually came out of the business world, so some of them are. But by and large, most pastors are not trained in that. And just imagine if I mean, whether you're a pastor or not, but if I'm forced to actually look at what it takes to build a successful business, now I have to say, if I'm doing it wrong, I'm gonna have to do something about it. And that's a pretty scary thing, I think, for most entrepreneurs. What's easier is to stumble into it, because you can kind of blame the market. You could blame, outside forces. You could say, it wasn't a good day. We put in 100, cold calls, got nobody. And actually, I tell a story about fishing, which is really about I kind of talk about customer engagement or sales and marketing. We think about this idea of, think about a fisherman, and I think you would quickly and instantly understand this, is that we could take 100 people out to fish, and if some of them actually know how to fish, they're going to know it's the little tiny things, flick of the wrist while your bait's bumping around, or the speed at which you reel, if it looks like a live fish or not. But everybody else is saying, There's a hook, there's bait, you throw it in, it's luck of the draw. And that's business, and that is the barrier, is that it's a lot easier for us to believe that what happens to us in business, it's the market forces. God didn't want me, God wanted me to go through this hard part so I'd be dependent on him. Maybe, but maybe it's because you just didn't implement wisdom. Maybe you just didn't understand fundamentals. So I think that's really the big barrier to entry, is now I'm going to have to take responsibility, and who wants to do that, right?
You're exactly right, and it's so necessary. It's almost been inbred that church is not a business; it's ministry. But I manage a nonprofit. I have overhead. I have a break-even number. I have offerings I have to generate at a certain level to keep the doors open, to keep people paid. I have break-even analysis. I have an accountant who advises me monthly where we are based on key performance indicators that I've given him. Say, if everything's tracking, don't call me, don't text me, don't send me any. But when you see a trend, I want to know about the trend. You're going to be my CFO. So I'm a big believer in outsourcing, especially in ministry, that I don't need to have a bookkeeper accountant in-house. I have a CPA. We deliver an envelope to the CPA once a week. He deals with all the paperwork involved in it. He allocates it, and he does it for a monthly retainer. And I couldn't pay an employee what I pay him because he knows exactly how to do it. He'll do it 100 times faster and more efficiently by giving it to a professional than having it in-house. I don't have to have that big staff. I outsource everything. We're talking with Brock Shinen, author of the new book, The Christian Entrepreneur: Dream, Plan, Execute, Grow. If you are in ministry and you're finding yourself grappling with some of the fundamentals, that you're dealing with a board, and the board may be a group of business people that can only bring in their own experience, how their companies do it, doesn't necessarily mean that their companies are doing it well either. And for you to walk around saying, well, I'm the guy that brings the scripture, I'm the guy that brings the message, I know how to preach the gospel, why do I need to know this? And it's because ultimately you are the point. You are the CFO, the CEO, the COO of every operation, whether or not it's a nonprofit like ours, which is a teaching ministry, or a church synagogue. You're the top guy. You are ultimately responsible for signing off on that plan and then executing. And if you don't know what it means, if you don't know why it has meaning, and if you've never addressed it before, you need a tool. And the tool can't be complex. It can't be a Harvard Business Review publication, because they're going to lose you on the second page when they start talking to you about statistical analysis and actuarial tables and all these other things that go into it. This is an extraordinary contribution to success. It is the, you wouldn't play for a football team without a playbook, and this can become the foundation for your playbook for your ministry. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to dig into some of the fundamentals, the blocking, the tackling, the running, the throwing, the fundamentals that make up how you can dream, how you can plan, how you can execute, and how you can grow in a Christian entrepreneurial environment with Brock Shinen. We'll be right back. The Lord meets you right where you are, and so does Igniting a Nation's new live streaming outlets. You can now watch Revealing the Truth, Revealing the Bible, and Prophecy Revealed simulcast live each Monday through Friday from 10 a.m. to 1 o'clock p.m. Central Standard Time on YouTube Live, Facebook Live, Vimeo, Periscope, and through our website, www.ignitinganation.com. No matter what device you are using, our program will automatically scale so you won't have to miss a single program. And if you happen to miss an episode, you can always subscribe to the Igniting a Nation YouTube channel and access over 1,000 interviews and never miss your favorite authors, special guests, and topics that interest you the most.
There are lots of ways to see Israel, but nothing compares to seeing the land of the book and the people of the book through the eyes of two Jewish believers who can take you on a journey that will bring the entire Bible to life. When you join Rabbi Eric Walker and his #1 rated tour guide, Edo Canaan in Israel, you'll experience incredible teachings, first-class accommodations, and actually walk where Jesus walked. You will experience the Bible transforming from black and white into living color, and you will never see the Bible in the same way again. For more information, visit us at www.ignitinganation.com/events.
The Lord contends with what contends with you, and Igniting a Nation is committed to bringing to light each and every issue that faces a believer's life. Our live stream programming and teachings take you on a journey to finding biblical truth from a wide variety of experts who share their insights into a deeper walk with the Lord. We have assembled the most comprehensive panel of experts in the fields of prophecy, caregiving, healing from trauma, shame, and abuse, and so much more. We continue to expand our teachings and programming to meet your needs. We're committed to healing the nations with biblical truth. Visit www.ignitinganation.com to develop a deeper walk with the Lord and start your journey to a transformed life. The Bible commands us to study to show ourselves approved, but most study using Bible study tools and not actually studying the Bible chapter and verse. Igniting a Nation is pleased to present Revealing the Bible, recorded and taught each week before a live audience. We take you deeper into the actual Bible and verse in both Hebrew and English and connect the dots between the Old and New Testament. You can attend our 2 classes in Tuscaloosa and Birmingham, or watch the program every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Central Time on ignitinganation.com and all our other simulcast outlets. For more information, visit www.ignitinganation.com/events. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heart lines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're talking with Brock Shinen, author of The Christian Entrepreneur, Dream, Plan, Execute, Grow. Brock, welcome back to the program.
Thanks so much to be here. So happy to be here.
Well, we're very happy to have you. Brock, as we dig into this, right off the top, what do you think that aspiring entrepreneurs, those who are looking either to launch or they've launched, what's the biggest trap for them? Where do you think they're the most likely to go wrong in this? The Lord's given them a vision, they've implemented it, and it seems to be working, but yet there's a trap waiting. What do you see that trap being, and how can I go back up and shore that up?
I would say the trap is to believe that you can't do better. I think to believe that what you're doing is the best you could be doing and the best way you could be doing it. And I would say that there's so much more available to you, whether you're dreaming and haven't started anything, or whether you've been doing this for 30 years. I mean, I remember there's a couple of really distinguishing moments in my career, things that people said to me that kind of set the tone for how I perceive, the answer to your question and many others. One being, I had a friend, a client that was also a friend that had been in a certain industry for close to 30 years. And I remember one day when they called me and said, hey, don't repeat this, but they asked a question, and it was a question that they literally should have known the first day in the industry, and they had been in it almost 30 years. And of course, I didn't shame them. We talked through the issue. We talked through the context. I helped them understand everything around it. But it really hit me how many people, I think this concept of we're stumbling towards success. And when you say, what's that trap door? I think part of it is believing that we've got all the tools that we need, that there's nothing else that could change our circumstances, and that is so far from the truth. And let me wrap up this answer with one more comment. I had a friend go to college in Kansas or Ohio. I don't remember which school, but he was a freshman, and he came back and he loved basketball. He didn't play, but he loved basketball. So he would go watch the practices of this team. And as I understand, it was a pretty good college team. And he came back and he was so excited to say, it's amazing. You have these guys that they're freshmen, they're just coming into the team. And then you have these other guys that are like, everybody knows them. If I said their name, you would know them. And the coach is like, fundamentals, guys. It's all about the fundamentals. And they're doing the exact same thing. The new kids and the old kids, granted within college, it's a limited space. But the point is the coach always brought them back to fundamentals, no matter how good they were. If there's a trapdoor for entrepreneurs, it is to believe that you cannot do things better. And in order to do things better, I think we start with going back to the fundamentals. I don't care if you've never done a business. I don't care if you've been in business for 30 years. And in some ways, those are the hardest people to get, because they believe, what you're telling me, I've been in business for 30 years. I've had 10 businesses. Guess what? When you're telling me and you're kind of bragging about, well, I've done over 2.5 million in every single one of my businesses. You may have done 20 million if you would have done some fundamentals, if you would have put in the work around understandings of fundamental elements. That, I think, is the big trapdoor.
So going back and identifying what those fundamental elements are,
Yeah.
and you clearly establish in the book that just the same way the basketball players had a playbook, that the playbook is the starting point in identifying your product, your service, your opportunity, who your target market is, what the you can be doing $25 million and in a market that's only a $30 million market. Okay, you've achieved terminal velocity. Okay?
Right.
You can't. The only place you can go is down, because other people are entering the business, and it can only erode yours. So then you begin to cut prices and begin to respond to market conditions as opposed to having a view. So what are those key elements, and where does it start? In your mind, the first thing that a Christian entrepreneur that has a business idea should do is what?
If the way that you frame the question, I would say we're looking at somebody who has an idea, wants to start it, what should they do? Because I do think the answer is a little bit different for somebody who's maybe been in business 5 years or 30 years. A little bit of a different nuance on how I would answer. But for the person, the entrepreneur that's saying, I have a vision and God gave it to me and I need to start this business, what I would say to that person is, let's talk about that idea. Let's talk about that vision. And I would want to know that they can articulate it. I mean, I think when we talk to business people, it's interesting to me how many of them can't really articulate very well what they do. Well, we make this product, but that doesn't say what you do. That doesn't say that's not a mission, right? If it's a service, if I just told you, hey, Brock, what do you do? And I said, well, I'm a lawyer. The assumption is you fill in the gaps based on my simple answer. I'm a lawyer. Well, you must go to court, you must counsel, you must negotiate. What if I told you I don't go to court at all? I used to, occasionally for different reasons, but I used to litigate. I don't litigate at all. So if I say, well, I'm a lawyer, and in your mind you're thinking Matlock, or you're thinking, I'm a city prosecutor putting people in jail, you've missed the mark completely on what I do, right? And the reason is because I didn't articulate to you what I did. Now, here's the problem. I'm much less worried about what you think I do. I'm much more worried about if I can't articulate what I do, then I don't understand how to execute it well. And people get in the habit of these broad answers, these amorphous, well, I'm a lawyer. We manufacture iPhone cases. We do financial planning services. What does that mean? I mean, when people come to me and say, well, you're a lawyer, what does that mean? What I do is the practice of law. If you talked a moment ago about this sort of terminal velocity. There's only, the only way to go is down. For me, practicing law means there's a million ways I can go. And if I hit the peak in one area, I'm going to branch out in 10 more areas that I haven't explored yet. So the way I view the legal market and the consulting market is it's an endless uh, space of opportunity. And if you ask me to articulate it, I would articulate it very differently than 99.9% of all entrepreneurs, simply because I'm gonna look into the details that I've explored, and I'm gonna talk about things that maybe weren't even on your radar, right? But I think with entrepreneurs by and large, they need to start with really understanding what they do in the nuanced detail. I say this, often we hear the devil's in the details. And to me, God's in the details. God's in the details of when he puts a plan in you, when he wants to ordain your steps, the details are what matter. How you execute is what matter. And if you don't understand what you do to the granular level, you can't possibly execute well. You will always be taking big steps where you think about if there's you're crossing a stream, you're crossing a river, and you got these little pebbles, these little stones that are 4 inches across. It matters if you're 1 inch off, and that's the entrepreneurial life. And yet we think, well, as long as I'm in the general direction of the next step, as long as I'm on social media. I mean, social media is a perfect example. As long as we're on social media, we have a Facebook page, we Twitter. Saying those words doesn't mean there's a strategy, but understanding and being able to articulate what your mission is will help dictate the strategy on those platforms. So I know it's a long-winded answer, but if I could start with one piece, and I had no other, like, Brock, you got one shot at this, what do you start with? Articulate what you're going to be doing. Articulate your mission, articulate what you are as a business, and that's where I would start, and then I would grow out of that.
All right, so that's the answer to the startup. And you said if I was talking to a startup, this is what I would say. If I'm talking to somebody who's been around for 7 or 8 years, this is what I would say. And one of the questions we have is, here's a business that's been around for 7 or 8 years, and now they've kind of reached a saturation point where they're established, but now opportunities to branch, as you talked about in law, opportunities to branch present themselves, whether or not it's franchising or joint venturing or a partial merger or forming a new LLC. What are some of the factors that they should take into consideration? My answer would be, well, how does it fit your vision? And if it doesn't fit your foundational vision, which you have to be able to articulate, then you have your yes or no, that it's not a fit. But if it is peripheral to your main business and will open up doors that you cannot open up yourself, what factors do you have people consider in that aspect of it to avoid some of the pitfalls?
Yeah, perfect. I think so. I read a lot. I mean, depending on the year, I think one year I read 60 something books. I read a lot, and one of the authors that I read is Simon Sinek. And if you're familiar, he's one of his books, I think, is Start with Why. And I think if we summarized, everything that you just said, it's really about, why are you doing it? Why do you need to do it? So if you're at a point, you're saying, I've hit market saturation, I'm looking at franchising, I'm looking at licensing our brand, I'm looking at opportunities to expand. One of the first questions I would ask is why? And they say, well, we've hit market saturation. I would want to explore that. I'd say, well, what guarantees to you that you've actually hit market saturation? What does that mean to you? And they say, well, because we can't go anywhere. I mean, think about this. There are, in churches, we talk about churches, there's, I think, over 350,000 documented churches in America. Maybe I'm off on the number, but, documented churches, 350,000. There's probably 1 million churches, because there's probably, 700 plus or minus 700,000 that aren't on any roster, right? Churches have automatic tax-exempt status in the United States, and they're not filing anything. They maybe just have a house church or a hotel church or a homeless ministry church where they're just showing up in a park and they're not on a roster. So 1 million churches. If you, and obviously this is not a scientific study, but I'm saying, if you said, well, I'm going to get all the churches in America, you're starting with a number of 350,000, right? But if you suddenly realize, oh, I'm saturated, I have 325,000, where else can I go? Well, there's probably 700,000 that are not on your radar. So that's a starting point. And the reason why I'm saying that is because I think we're so quick to make assumptions about where we're at that we never step back to ask the hard questions. And for me, that's fundamental. That's fundamental to the book that I wrote. That's fundamental to Crush the Stops book about getting
Right.
things done, is asking the hard questions like, why are we not digging into the details of how we assumed we already have the answer? Let's step back. Let's deconstruct. Let's reverse engineer. And what I think we find with the business that's been around for 7 years, 17 years, 37 years, and says, I'm saturated. I've hit the highest plateau in my industry. I can't go any higher. Imagine sitting down with the CEO of Apple, of Google, of eBay, whatever, and saying, "Are you saturated? Have you saturated the market?" They'd be like, "You're insane. There's endless possibility. There's no saturation." And I'll end with this. When if and I think I've used this story a lot. I don't know if I used it in my book, but imagine buying a timber company. You're cutting logs, whatever you're doing with those logs, but you're cutting logs. One of the byproducts is sawdust, right? So if we get these piles of sawdust and we see it as an expense, bring in the trucks, grab the sawdust, ship it out, and destroy it however we deal with sawdust. We're dealing with the timber because we see that as our primary business objective, never considering the fact that when we think, okay, we've saturated the market with our timber business, we've sold all the timber we can, we have an asset, sawdust, sitting there, and we're treating it as an expense. It's another business opportunity. So I think really to circle back to the start, the origins of the question is, I want to start with why we even think this. Then I want to deconstruct. Are we sure about the assumptions we've made to base our why, to create our answer out of that why of this is what we need to do? Let's go backwards a little bit. And that's, I mean, in my consulting side of my practice, where I just do strategy consulting, that's what we're doing all day long. Let's go back. Let's deconstruct. Let's look at your assumptions. Let's figure out how you got here and why, and make sure that we're actually on the right footing in terms of understanding what options are there. Kind of doing, if you did a SWOT analysis, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? But what are the opportunities here that maybe we've completely overlooked? And that's why I said earlier, as a lawyer, you could never tell me that I've hit my peak in terms of who I can reach. It'll never be true. Because there will always be more opportunity. It will just look different. So I think that's my answer.
Okay. As a Christian entrepreneur, emphasis on Christian, and we've got 1 minute left, what are the 3 essential differences that you would hope would be demonstrated by a Christian entrepreneur versus a non-believing entrepreneur?
1 minute, that's a tough question. I will start by saying we don't need to put a Bible verse on everything. If we are Christians and we're carrying the Spirit of God in us, then the Spirit of God is with us and on us in everything that we do. There doesn't have to be a Bible verse or a cross on everything. So that's number 1, is to walk into a situation and realize we don't actually have to start screaming the scriptures for the scriptures to show up. Number 2, we have to model Christ. We have to model generosity and support and selflessness and all of the character traits of who God is. We have to model those. Some of those are completely consistent with the world's best practices. Some of those are not. You started, when you talked about, executives that treat, basically I got to shove you out to move into your spot, versus others who are sewing in, and the way that they move is by giving to others. Those are all us modeling Christ. So I know I'm trying to pack in a very complex answer into a very short time, but I think those 2 things, if I had to pick right out of the gate, those would be the 2 things. Don't put crosses and verses on everything you do. Walk in knowing you're filled with God and you're going to bring him into that situation, whatever it is, with the world's best practices. He's there already. Number 2 is just what I said, so I don't want to keep repeating.
Okay. Brock, one last yes or no question.
Yeah.
Whether I started the business with a business plan or I've matured and I don't have a business plan, should I take the next step that I take, should it be to create a business plan so that I have key performance indicators, I can benchmark, I can see where I'm tracking towards goals, and it's not a spreadsheet, it's not a QuickBooks output, it's actually a business plan that's broken into traditional sections of market analysis and goal setting and cash flow analysis and the various things, so that when I go to make these decisions, do I franchise, do I take on joint venture, I have a living, breathing document that I'm constantly updating with market information. Is that an essential ingredient in all cases?
Here's your best legal answer: yes and no. No, for the vast majority of entrepreneurs, because that business plan is way too complex, way too amorphous, and way too heady to really understand as a guidebook for your business. Yes, in the sense that you do need a business plan, but it needs to be simple, short, effective, and to the point. And that's what I talk about in the book when I talk about business plans. Is there's certain elements you need, but the idea of a business plan, yes, you need a business plan, but it's not what you think it looks like for most businesses. There's certainly space for that traditional 30-page, it has this section, it has that section. The business plan that most entrepreneurs need really needs them to focus on who's doing what, where's the money coming from, how are they spending it. So it's a lot of the same information, but it's tweaked in terms of the perspective on how it's integrated into the plan.
Well, I could talk to you for hours, and as a matter of fact, I'm going to invite you back for us to do a brainstorming session, digging into a lot more questions about this particular issue. If you would agree to come back on the show and have more of a dialogue that it will help a lot more people by hearing us discuss some of these things with a way of encouraging them. Hey, here's a resource that's going to spell all this out, but if you're unsure what even some of these things mean, they're going to help you define that. We're talking with Brock Shinen, author of The Christian Entrepreneur, Dream, Plan, Execute, Grow. You can find more about him at brockshinen.com. And if you're interested in the book, just go to ignitingnation.com, pick up just click on today's broadcast schedule. You're going to see Brock's book. It's going to say, love the interview, buy the book. Click here, and it'll take you right to a place to get a copy of this book. Brock Shinen, I will see you again, and we'll get an invitation out to you to come back on the program and continue in this discussion. I think it's one that's extremely important, relevant, and it is going to be a lifesaver for many. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
God
Thanks
bless.
so much.
We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.